Good morning, y'all. Again, look, I can't even blame it on being sick. I think I was reading two different things. I think I was reading I think I know, I was reading Moodle and not the new syllabus. So I'll switch to Moodle so you could upload your Sartre review and we'll be straight. All right. So hopefully, I don't know what order you're going to watch these videos, but hopefully, mine would be helpful. The other three that I sent you, the short three, are more on a specific concept. Um, and so, the idea of self negation. So, you can find your help with that. All right, so let me open my notes here. So, obviously, we're going to focus on another giant of existentialism um, in Jean Paul Sartre, right? Probably in this 20-25 minute discussion, I'll do, obviously some context. I'll talk a little bit about his early writings since we're not doing all his work, and especially the early ones from 1930 to 1945, because they focus really on the existential in the way that I think we need to, because that's the course, right? It's not really to say that his existentialists writing waned per se, but it's just say that from 1934 to about 1945, it's pretty clear, right? Uh, I think we should probably think about five major works, um, um, three kind of small ones, right? One real big one, uh, and then kind of one right in the middle. Um, yeah, I think that's what we'll do. All right. Obviously, when the semester first started, his 1945 piece, Existentialism is a Humanism, we read a little bit about that, which obviously to all existentialists, it's our first read, right? It's our manifesto of sort, right? Even before we get to Heidegger's system, I think Sartre's humanism is, kind of our Bible, if you will. Primarily because it's written, in defense of existentialism, and with humanism being explicitly in mind. Um, so, I don't know. Sartre is sort of has to be considered as one of the foremost European intellectual figures of the 20th century, both in existentialism, phenomenology, literature, drama, right, and no exit, stuff like that. And then obviously we talked about with Camus, he was extremely political as well, right? Um, our next read is Simone de Beauvoir, and sort of he has a lifelong relationship with her, and like I said, he loved her and fell out with so many other folk, right? So you can imagine, they probably argued a few times too, But yeah, so I think that for us to begin this conversation, I think what's going to be crucial is for us to think about every. I don't know if you can go back to humanism if you remember, or go back to your notes, but certainly it would be good to kind of go back. Um, he died 1980, um, and yeah, died in 1980. And obviously, famous writer in general. I mentioned when I talked about Camus, who accepted the Nobel Prize. Sartre turned down the Nobel Prize in 1938. Um, his book Nausea, right? Obviously, you're not reading it. I think you should read it. It's phenomenal. I might talk about it a little bit in a few minutes, but Nausea won him a Nobel Prize for literature. He turned it down though, right? Um, but pretty much, from ages from around 1935, 1936 to 1945, he really put forth a major corpus of existentialist writing. Sartre's kind of his philosophy developed sort of building on Heidegger, and so that's why I was thinking Heidegger first, probably, and then obviously having its own merits and foothold as well. Existentialism as humanism, which we read, is generally seen as maybe the most explicit of his existentialist writing. Is based on a lecture, right, that he did in Paris. It's a defense of a way of life that various people were coming at him and coming at all the existentialists at the time as negative and pessimistic, dark, dangerous, right? And obviously, you understand how people could see it that way. But Sartre argues that his writing, that the attacks on his writing were an error, extremely misguided, wrong, because it's not, you may interpret it that way, or that may be what you feel from the reading or from understanding existentialist ideas, but the reality is existentialism is a philosophy of freedom, right? It's a highly positive philosophy, right? Indeed, I think we should probably think about, here is where the major line of all of existentialism comes from with Sartre, when he says what? Existence precedes essence, right? And it still holds in philosophy classes today, right? It is, kind of the common definition with looking at, objects and phenomena. They precede, my experience precedes essence, that kind of thing, right? For instance, a table, for instance, will have the idea of the maker, and then it comes into existence through that maker, right? So other animals, for instance, their pattern of behavior, sort of maybe can be instincts, if you will, that can be reliably predicted before they're born, right? But existentialism argues something different, right? It says that because of freedom and free will we talked about before, although there are some formal functions, some universal principles, things like that. But because of freedom, the formal dynamics and structures are known, the details, particulars, blah, blah, blah. But the contents to any individual's life cannot be known or predicted before the person lives, right? And develops as humans exist first, and then they live in relationships to other essences, right? Their past, their physicality, stuff like that. I think about our conversation in class of the day about people placing, sort of essences on newborns and what they should become and things like that. For existentialist philosophy, for real, we're talking about that stuff comes later, that people have to live, and then their essence is created. The essence comes after one exists, primarily because of freedom and choices, right? So for Sartre, right, there are what he calls sort of atheistic, which he is, and theistic, which I am, forms or types of existentialism. With him and Heidegger, sort of being in the atheistic kind of category, right? And obviously, we haven't got to Kierkegaard yet, but certainly Kierkegaard, Miguel de Mundo, Augustine, people like that might be even looked at as Christian existentialists or religious or theistic existentialists, right? Uh, Sartre is not influenced by God, but um, all the previous existentialists, he references them throughout all of his work, right? And like Heidegger, I mean, very influenced by Heidegger, but like him, he has his own kind of system as well. His system says ultimately, it begins around, ultimately is about freedom, responsibility, and choice, right? Um, as you remember, Sartre gave in Humanism, he gave a example of a young man having to choose between going off to fight in a war or staying home and looking after his mother. Our sort of nature is such that we can't really give definitive answers or determinations, right? We cannot. Why? Because if we did, then we have no freedom, right? So to Sartre, there's no such thing as not being free, right? Or not having free choices, right? We have to decide for ourselves and live with the consequences of our actions one way or another. Finally, I think I would say on humanism, existentialism is humanism, because we all share the same basic structure within the human condition and within the universe, because we are all sort of free in our societies or various type of situation to various sort of extent. Sartre argues that it's automatically about humans, right, and their interaction, thus humanism, right, and thereby arguing against essentialist philosophers or things like that. Existentialism can be seen as pessimistic and have other negative kind of positions, but it also promotes, though, that one must embrace freedom and humanity, sort of no matter what, right? Embrace freedom and humanity, no matter how hard it might be at certain times, right? So one of his early writings was called The Transcendence of the Ego. The Transcendence of the Ego. It's more of a phenomenological text, right? That is really not really read much today, but it has existential foundations and insights to what? Human personality, right? The transcendence of the ego is a powerful and I think interesting argument regarding sort of first objective principles of nature and not subjective nature of the ego, right? Not of nature, of the nature of the ego, right? So there's objective ego, and then the subjective nature of the ego. And the subjective, obviously, is our gaze, right? Our eye, our personality, and things like that. He argues that there's no such thing as a sort of a deep and fixed subjectivity, right? If you're write that down to see if you think about that. There is no such thing as a fixed subjectivity, right? It's neither required of fixed subjectivity, or does it actually help with a theory of personality, right? And maybe trying to argue for a fixed subjectivity, it does sort of that theory a disservice, I think, right? Uh, um, sort of the idea of consciousness and I think this is why sort of precisely pre-reflective consciousness, where we all are, we just are automatically unreflective, right? I'm sorry, I said that wrong. We all experience pre-reflective consciousness. That's just kind of natural. But sort of there are unreflective, engaged activities that we do in the world, like getting a cup of coffee, uh, grabbing your book bag, walking to class, right? The act is not reflective; it's more unreflective, right? You may do some reflection while you're doing it, but that's not the point. It's the act itself, right? So the ego then, well, there's a second reflection where the ego, the I, sort of the I can disappear. I mean, kind of disappear or appear, if you will, and sort of like not catching the bus, but what? I ran for the bus, or I made a cup of coffee, right? Not just the process of making it, but the self-reflection of I am doing something, right? This sort of secondary moment for Sartre, the ego appears on this level as an object, right? For that reflective consciousness, right? I am doing something. And so the I becomes an object engaged, right, in something. The subjectivity is there, but we have to now reflect on what the I have done, right? Maybe on the most primary pre-reflective level, and sort of the sort of a transcendent gaze in the world, right? Transcendent meaning outside of the here, right? And so we can look at the I from, a sort of a transcendent nest, if you will. But then on the reflective level, consciousness can make itself an object whereby a more explicit, sense of person, an ego, appears or represents itself, right? So for Sartre, he kind of says, well, look, this reflection has a structural language that we all share. And indeed, the ego itself is an objective position and remains kind of nebulous or opaque, if you will. I don't know. Sartre sort of likes to reflect, like Heidegger, reflect on one's feelings and emotions and summarizes them by saying, for instance, someone says, I am angry, right? So actions now become reflected upon what? The summary of our phenomenology, right? Or the things that we've done in the world, right? Actions are reflective as we think about things. I ran for the bus. I made a cup of coffee. And qualities, if you will, are summaries of sort of multiple states, right? So qualities, meaning, as I say, so what kind of person are you, right? Well, I'm an angry dude, or I'm a thoughtful dude, or, I love sweet tea, right? I can come to that statement, that reflective statement, based on multiple states of reflection where I became happy or X makes me angry, whatever that is, right? I only come to that because of various states that I've experienced, right? And so if we want to talk about ourselves, then Sartre's challenge in this way is that we will always be obliged to talk about ourselves in this sort of reflective language, right? And maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that's right? Because it means every human consciousness shares its structure, and every human consciousness is sort of how we communicate our feelings and other characteristics and experiences quite easily and readily. Consciousness and a sum of the consciousness, the sum of the experiences, right, is how we can explain it, right? So people like Husserl or even Freud, right, are looking at the world phenomenologically, that kind of thing. Ego, right? Might be I'm not that deep here in Freudian psychology. I'm some, but not deep. But I know that ego is sort of an unnecessary illusion for Sartre, but it's important for Freud, right? And actually, ego only, that's why it's ego within the moment as opposed to transcendence of the ego. And actually only really happens when one picks up something objective, back to systems. Reflective egos, right? I think so. And so he has this concept called the magic of the ego, namely taking sort of the original objective and passive nature of the ego and then transforming it into a supposed act and source of the true cause of all happenstance or spontaneity, which then, once you transform it, is not happenstance or spontaneity anymore. I know that's next level stuff, but think about it. Called the magic of the ego. He doesn't like the ego in a sense of a Freudian or a sense, but he wants to say that it takes reflection and some sense of transformation so that the ego now can become an objective thing and not a subjective thing, right? The reality for Sartre is that there's always a reflective spontaneity, right? Especially initially, although they can be sort of made secondary through what he calls this magic trick of the ego, right? So this theory, right? This theory of the magic of the ego has sort of insights that were, back then groundbreaking, and and maybe even can contribute to theories of personhood and identity, right? Even right now, right? But from the very first sort of early on, Sartre kind of he took up sort of logical principles, right? But did in such a way to develop a theory on his own, right? With a particular style and his own particular insights and contributions. Obviously, to existentialism and an innovative way of thinking of subjectivity and personality, right? And yeah. So unlike Heidegger, though, who talks about moods, right? Sartre, there is a such thing as the emotional, right? The emotional state and engagement with the world where you are just going about your daily business in kind of, a very practical way. Back to making a morning coffee. It's just nothing reflective about it. But what is different for Sartre is that human consciousness often clashes with determinism and causality. And there's a difficulty of the world in both negative and positive ways. So sort of both instigating emotion itself, if you will, as well as reacting emotively or passionately to the phenomena that we experience in the world. And when it does, an emotion is the result, and we spontaneously assign qualities to things and people in the world, what? Through this relationship, right? Now that'll come back again in terms of how we ascribe quality through relationship with others in the world, right? That'll come back again with Sartre. I'm thinking about the word images, right? For Sartre, right, the image is a whole form, right? An entire, complete type of consciousness. But imagining is not something sort of added or taken away from perception, but it is this term of apprehending the object, right? Again, that's getting a little metaphysical and psychological, but I'm just thinking about in terms of how we see images and imagination and this idea of the transcendence of the ego. Maybe we could talk about that in class, right? But if the point is, I was thinking about just now was, if perception is endless and infinite, and I am constantly learning from perception, and if perception is about something I simply understand, like, I don't know, a triangle, for instance, then it really kind of observes its objects, but it does so in a manner that's not infinite or without end, right? So perception may not be, right? Sartre states that with an image, I get out of it only what I put into it, right? If I know how many pillars a pantheon has, for instance, I can imagine it that way. But if I don't, no amount of imagining is going to change my knowledge of a number of pillars in a pantheon. Indeed, I would have to actually see it, perceive it, that is, or be told by somebody trustworthy in a testimony. Right? Maybe. I don't know. The imaginary sort of is a realm of artistic creations, captivation that sort of allows spontaneity of our consciousness. Our minds have to have free reign in creating and playing with so many images and realized experiences. And so to that end, I know I went on a tangent here with this, but I like images. That's what really got me thinking about art. With my master's thesis in philosophy. But to that end, Sartre argues that external physical images, they also sort of form a particular section of the imaginary, right? They have the same formal structure, right, as internal physical images like a triangle, right? And what is the original concept? What is the psychoanalytics? What is the material that evokes the image, whether in real or transcendent, external or internal, right? So that includes, right, paintings, pictures, the computer screen, right, nowadays, if you will, right? That kind of stuff, right? But, I know I kind of digressed there of a certain sense. But, wow. The reason I wanted to think about that, because Sartre is not just, he has a system, right? And that's why I want us to think about that. But let me move a little faster. We don't have to deal with that, especially for the readings we're dealing with. But I do want to talk about nausea for a minute. And I think that's what we're talking about in terms of imagination. Nausea for Sartre is most basically and ontologically its substance is our original recognition of the utter contingency of being in itself. I'll repeat that. Nausea for Sartre is most basically our original, sort of the ontological understanding of it, the basic understanding of it, is our original recognition of the utter contingency of being in itself. As obviously as the other book that he wrote, Being Enough, this nausea is a sort of an ontological recognition that conditions are made and makes all others more specifically nauseous, and even makes others possible in the first place. Right? Nausea is a sort of a recognition ontologically that conditions and makes all others more nauseous and nauseous, if you will, and possible in the first place. For him, there's a category of being, right? And this is what I'll probably talk about Thursday. And so this idea of being in and of itself, being in itself. Right now he gets a lot like Heidegger, but we haven't read Heidegger technically, so we'll kind of break that down. And sort of being in and of itself, or the one for itself, is a conscious being, right? Which never simply is what it is and is the contrary, right? Sort of on the, well, I might need a board for this. I don't know, consciousness as being for itself. Remember, the term is being for itself, right? Being dash for dash itself, right? You will see that. Being for itself shows that for a being to be aware of other beings and itself, it needs to have some distance between itself and other beings, right? Being for itself means that in order to be aware of other beings and itself, it needs to have some critical distance or minimal distance between itself and other things. And this is this idea of nothingness, right? Being in nothingness. This is where we bring in nothingness. Being in and of itself, or being in itself, as that term, being in itself, is pure positivity. Just as being for itself produces nothingness by spontaneity, and sending a sort of a fissures into being, and sort of creates the sort of the gaps in consciousness, right? So you have two phrases: being in itself and being for itself. Look that up. Look it up. Google it. Get that understanding before class. Being in and of its, being in itself and being for itself. In those senses, Sartre is saying consciousness is separated from itself and other beings by what? Nothing. Being and nothingness, right? Our ability to question, like even in Heidegger, our ability to assign negative values to basically any phenomena, as in our concept of destroying something, all point to this fundamental and constant sort of exuding of nothingness that Sartre calls annihilation and freedom. Freedom here is just sort of a basic, it's just very basic, it's absolute, it's uncontrollable spontaneity of force, right? That's what freedom is in this sense. It's more basic than sort of reflective ideas of the freedom of the will, right? It's just more natural, right? And so anxiety or anguish, the kind of words that even Heidegger would use, he breathes too, but he calls it nausea, right? And through this feeling of nausea, we are inherently aware of the spontaneous conscious freedom that we all are in, which in this sense can often feel a bit like too much freedom is not necessarily always a good thing, right? And I think the last thing I'll say on this is that it's important to note that this conception does not mean an absolute sort of untethered freedom, a kind of political libertarianism, right, if you will, Jared. Being for itself and its inherent consciousness of with freedom are always in a live dynamic with what? The material world. And effective activities and events in the world stemming from all of this is from the interaction with being in itself. It's being from itself, being in itself. Right? And then his third piece is being for others. Being in itself, being for others, right? And being for itself, right? Being for others. How can I say this? This is the type of being that conscious being for itself, we cannot give to others. It is sort of our, it's our subjectivity that, how can I put this? We might have a minimal physical feeling of objectivity through what? Our lived bodies, right? Engagement with the physical world, that kind of stuff. But we as subjects only become objects for who? Other subjects through what? Being for others. Right? So again, we experience something in our own lived bodies. We engage with the world. But we as subjects become objects for other subjects through our being for others. This is constituted by what Sartre calls the gaze, G-A-Z-E, right? The recognition, the look, is the principle of our being for others, and shame, like nausea and anxiety, a term for the most primal recognition of others about you, and turns our subjectivity into objectivity. He has a famous keyhole example where there's an individual engrossed in sort of eavesdropping on something through a keyhole, and he is really engaged and submerged in his own subjective projects and aims, and suddenly there is a noise on the stairs, and he is instantly aware of his own objectivity. Somebody is watching him watching others. This is precisely the look where there's no need to physicalize looking, but the look is also a phenomenon in the same way that noise triggers what? Shame. Because now we become object for somebody else's subjectivity, whether real or imagined. Right? So, I tell you before, he doesn't believe in God. We'll talk about those in class. He doesn't believe in God, right? He's sort of, he believes in spirits, not spirits like, a spirit, right? I don't know, he doesn't believe in God. I'll leave it that way. He is an atheistic existentialist. And he sort of would say something like a higher principle that is stripped of what human value um, we need to respect and be in awe of. But the bottom line is he understands that, but not in a sort of a physical or even a form that creates, right? We create, right? Freedom and freedom is always must always be a part of the human experience, right? Then obviously there's terms like bad faith. Those of you who read my last book, I talk about Sartre and bad faith in my last book. So yeah, I don't know. That should be enough to think about. Obviously I want you to think about being in itself, being for itself, and being for others. I want you to think about those three for class. We will begin there on Thursday, and I hope this, gives you a little bit more background of his system, right? Of his system. All right, take care.